IGERT program. That IGERT stands for Integrated Graduate Education Research Traineeship. And our program is one of about 120 IGERT programs in the United States, and ours is entitled Sea Change, Climate Change, Humans, and Nature in the Global Environment. And as part of our colloquium series today, I'm pleased to introduce Professor Donald Brown. And I've just spent with some of our IGERT trainees an hour and a half with him, and we've heard quite a bit about what he does. So I don't so much have to refer to my notes taken from the internet, since I've heard from the horse's mouth himself about what he's done. So Don has a JD. He's an attorney, and he's also has an engineering degree, and he's very engaged right now with issues of ethics. He comes to us from Penn State University, where he's in the Science and Ethics and Technology department. But prior to that, he worked for the U.S. government and the state governments of New Jersey and Pennsylvania, and has represented the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency in talks at the United Nations. In fact, for those of you who follow the international protocols on biodiversity and on climate change, Don has been at the table, often representing the United States in virtually all of them, I guess starting with Rio de Janeiro in 1992 and involved in Kyoto. So he comes with not only an academic and ethics training and a technical background and a law degree, but also with extensive experience in working in the public sector. So today, he didn't entitle his talk, "Is Climate Change Science Disinformation a Crime Against Humanity?" Although I urged him to do that. And it was the title of a 2010 Guardian newspaper article. But he will talk about what happens when you say that, and that is the disinformation campaign that occurs in response to challenges to the status quo when it comes to climate change. So, thank you.
Well, thanks. It's great to be at another large state university for a change. It's also good to be not in Penn State today. Obvious to you. I am delighted here to talk about this issue. A little bit more about my background, how I come to why I do what I do. I was a litigating lawyer for both. I was in charge of New Jersey's environmental enforcement in the early 70s. I was assistant attorney general in Pennsylvania while I'm studying philosophy and ethics at the New School for Social Research in night school. So I have come to believe that you can't have a good critical thinking about climate change without spotting and understanding the ethical dimensions of climate change, that in fact some of the confusion that we have about the science comes from failure to see that this is science applied to public policy, which raises ethical questions which are not raised when
Sorry.
So, in any event, during my career, I kept saying, these are all ethical questions that public policy is facing. Why doesn't anyone talk about this? I'm going to talk about the science of climate change and the ethics of climate change. I am going to argue that this may be some kind of new crime against humanity. I didn't realize you wanted me to title the talk, but that's what I'm going to talk about. So, before I get to the disinformation campaign, I have to encourage you to think about, is there something about this problem that is screaming for attention as an ethical or moral issue? Is there something about climate change, not only climate change, about the global issues that are screaming for attention, to see it fundamentally, centrally, as an ethical and moral problem? And if that's the case, the way we're talking about it, there's something hugely missing from the way we talk about this problem. So first, I want to argue that climate change must be understood as an ethical problem, because it's a problem where some people are putting others at risk. As you know, it's usually the larger emitting countries, usually but not always developed countries that are putting the most vulnerable people are poor people in parts of the world. So it's an ethical problem because some people are causing it, but the victims are not necessarily the people causing the problem. The second reason why we must understand this is an ethical problem is because the harms to the victims are not mere inconveniences, they are potentially catastrophic to them. We're talking about death and destruction of natural resources. We could talk about the water, the riversheds in Southeast Asia, which are all glacier-fed, where there's already water fights already breaking out. We could talk about the small island developing states. By the way, this fight has been going on for 30 years now. I've been involved since 1992 in it. It's the small island developing states which have been the most consistently screaming to see this as a matter of justice. We could talk about Africa that gets hit 8 or 9 different ways. Africa is the most heavily, adversely, harshly affected, in my view, about climate change, whether it's droughts or floods or food production or vector-borne disease or whatever. We could talk about human health and whose human health is at risk. We could talk about intense storms and who's more vulnerable to intense storms, and it's not everybody. So, the second reason why we must understand this as an ethical question is because harms are catastrophic. Certainly potentially catastrophic if you don't believe that the 10 million people as we speak suffering amazing hunger in the Horn of Africa, given the fact that we think it's likely due to human causation, is not catastrophic enough. Just wait. According to the consensus view, much more harsher impacts on poor people around the world are in store. This is something I don't need to tell most of the people in this audience. But the third reason why we must see this as an ethical issue is even more troubling and interesting, I think. And that is the victims can't petition their governments to protect them from this. Their governments can't do anything. Their only hope, the reason why Bolivia and the small and developing states are becoming or screaming in the international negotiations to the developed countries, don't you see this as a matter of justice, is because their governments can't protect them. They have to hope. Their only hope is the large nations and individuals, including individuals in developing countries, will see that they have duties, responsibilities, and obligations that will protect them. Their best hope is getting the world to wake up that this is a matter of justice. They get that this is a matter of justice. They've been talking about justice as the primary framing of this issue in the international negotiations with louder and more intense focus on it almost every year in the COPs. And so, what I've tried to convince you that there's something about this that demands that be seen as an ethical problem in ways that state strategy could sort of simply maximize welfare or do other sort of policy interventions and ignore the justice questions. But there's something about this problem that really requires that we fundamentally see it as a matter of justice. Now, when I talk about ethics, most people don't know what I'm talking about. And that's because I believe there's a failure to educate even very smart people about what ethics is, what it does, what its interests are, what its concerns are. When I use the word ethics, I mean the serious critical reflection on claims that given certain facts, which, by the way, provides immediately a role for science and economics, because facts are relevant to ethical questions, that given certain facts, something is right or wrong, something is obligatory or non-obligatory, or when responsibility attaches to human behavior. That's what ethics does. It examines claims and the rationality of claims that something is right or wrong. Now, to say that ethics has to be introduced into climate negotiations is not to claim that it's not already there. if you follow the debate in the United States, which I have been and have my students follow, there are two kinds of arguments against climate policies that are made all the time. In fact, the debate's now 35 years old, at least. And those claims are we should, notice the word should, which is a normative claim, do anything about this because there's not the science is uncertain or there's no scientific basis for it or scientific arguments. So they're making a normative claim, but it's not identified as a normative claim. And that's what's so shocking about this problem is the failure to turn up the volume on the ethical dimensions of scientific claims. And I'll explain a lot of that in a few minutes. So ethics is already there, but the ethics are often hidden in what appear to be value-neutral discourses, science and economics for the most part. Most people can't spot the ethical issues. PhDs can't spot the obvious ethical questions raised by the way that these issues are being debated, which is itself remarkable and shocking because the ethical questions are so obvious, as I will explain in a second. Now, identifying the ethical issues does not mean that we will agree what ethics requires. When you identify ethical questions, there are three possibilities. One is there's actually an overlapping consensus, what philosophers call an overlapping consensus between ethical theories. Another possibility is we have conflict. We don't agree at all what ethics requires. But there's a third possibility, which is even more interesting, and that is we may not agree what ethics requires, but we agree that one of the positions is unjust. We can spot injustice. In fact, there's growing biological evidence that even babies and even monkeys can spot injustice. And so the failure to identify the ethical questions as ethical questions takes off the table the ability to either spot issues which we agree on what the ethical response is, but more important and more practically, a whole series of positions on climate change that no ethical system would condone. So what I do is I follow the actual debate about climate change. I do not do ethics in the abstract. I follow the actual debate. I try to tease out of the debate the ethical issues that are not usually identified in the debate by anybody, by the academy, by the scientists, by the policymakers, and certainly not the press. I believe it's particularly diseased in the United States. The Europeans seem to be better at identifying the obvious ethical questions. But people in other countries are getting the ethical questions, which is in itself quite interesting. So, as I stated, almost all the arguments against doing something are variations of different claims about the science, everything from, well, we don't know what some of the negative feedbacks are in the system, or we don't really know what climate sensitivity is, to claims that the entire thing is a hoax, that there's no basis for it, there's no evidence of human causation. The scientific claims go from out-and-out lies and untruths to issues that may be true but may not affect what ethics would require you to do if they were in fact true, which is a whole other issue. And as you know, probably most scientists that I know, there's a book that's called The Consensus View, and I'll talk about that, really believe we're running out of time to prevent 2 degrees centigrade warming, and the 2 degrees centigrade warming has been agreed to now as an international goal. It's quite controversial. All the IPCC can say is that probabilities of rapid nonlinear responses of the systems go up dramatically above 2 degrees centigrade, but they actually may go up at 1 degree centigrade. In fact, we may be past the point of no return as we speak. The truth is that we will trigger the rapid nonlinear response of the climate system. If the oceans get warm enough, they will liberate methane hydrates. It happened 55 million years ago. You get a 5 or 6 degree centigrade change in a relatively short period of time. It's my take on what the science is saying that we're on the verge of running out of time to create the emissions reductions, to have any confidence that we're going to limit the warming to levels that will be below certain levels. This is the famous IPCC chart that explains all that. What most people don't know now is what I'm about to tell you, is that forces you to think about what the stabilization level should be in the atmosphere. Should it be 550 parts per million or 450 parts per million? No national strategy makes any sense. Not Kansas strategy, not the university strategy, not the city of New York strategy makes any sense unless it's implicitly understood to be a position on the atmospheric stabilization level that we have a duty to cooperate on with other people around the world. So one of the missing elements in the ethical discussion is if you have a position on what your cap should be, what is your position on what the stabilization level would be, and how do you get from your cap to a stabilization level that doesn't hurt other people? Right away, there's some missing elements that are required by ethics in the debate that are not part of the public discussion. It's amazing and shocking, it seems to me, that we can talk about a cap for the United States and never once mention how the U.S. cap, which the Obama position is 17% below 2000, which is 4% below 1990, making it the weakest of all of the positions in the international negotiations. What does that mean in terms of the stabilization level? And I'm now oversimplifying a lot of science, but the science is that there is a consensus that if we wanted to limit warming to 2 degrees centigrade, then prudence would require us to reduce emissions by 25 to 40% by 2020. And none of the international agreements are coming close to that. And so there is amazing disconnect from my view of what the mainstream scientists are saying and what governments are willing to do, even the EU and other more aggressive governments. But you can't think about any of that without thinking about what the stabilization level is. And so every position is implicitly a position on the stabilization level. So there's a disconnect between science and policy, and it's pretty amazing disconnect. I could go through, now I'm going to turn to the history of the science of climate change. I'm going to skip over all sorts of stuff, but to bring you to where I think we are, we've known about the greenhouse effect since 1820. We've known very precisely in watts per square meter what each greenhouse gas would do in terms of warming since 1858. Arrhenius did the first prediction. Callendar produced the first claim that the humans were warming the planet in 1936. They all admitted some uncertainty about timing and magnitude. And what most Americans don't know, we know that the greenhouse gases are human caused. There's 8 different lines of evidence of human causation. The usual people make claims that there's no evidence of human causation. They're called fingerprint studies. I was sitting at the microphone representing the United States at 2 o'clock in the morning in 1997 when the whole world, including the scientists of countries that have opposed this position, including Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and Iran, who are our allies in opposing anything, all agreed that the fingerprint studies was pretty strong evidence that this is human causation despite all the natural variability. My claim is that there are abundant, robust lines of evidence of human causation that led IPCC to say, for four reports, they made different claims with different levels of confidence about human causation. And the last one was in 2007, where they said it's 95%, the 95% confident that almost all the warming is human caused. What most people don't know, that there's evidence about that in the scientific literature. So, now before I get into the disinformation campaign, I am not against skepticism in science. Skepticism is the oxygen of science. We want to encourage skepticism. There are some of us, people have called it some skeptics, I do not lump into the category of what I call the ideologic climate deniers who are different than reasonable skepticism. No reasonable skepticism would support what these folks have been doing and continue to do for the last 25 years. So I'm going to talk about what I call ideological climate deniers. I don't necessarily mean people like Linston and a couple of the other people that appear as skeptics. And by the way, when I teach climate science, I make my students find the strongest skeptical argument they can make it great if they can find one that is reasonably strong. And I tell them, don't believe what I say. I can tell you, my job is to make you a better critical thinker about all of this. And I send them off, and then they have to do another paper from the consensus point of view. And most of them are amazed how strong the science of climate change is, even though some of them start and finish my classes being deniers, and I encourage them to, in fact, do this. So my job is not to tell you what to think, but to tell you what I think critical thinking would require you to investigate in all of this. Now, there is uncertainty in the climate science. And the real uncertainty, in my view, is really limited to one or two issues, and that is what are the positive and negative feedbacks and how do they operate. There still is some uncertainty about a couple of the feedbacks, particularly clouds and aerosols as potential negative feedbacks. So even people like Jim Hansen acknowledges there could be things, although the probability is really low, according to Jim, that climate may not be as bad as the IPCC says. In my own view, and this is my view, IPCC is understating the risk greatly, not overstating it, but that's your decision to make, not my decision. I can tell you why I think that. It's your responsibility to figure that out yourself. There is uncertainty, and one of the great uncertainties is this is a complex, chaotic system. And the truth of the matter is, we don't know where we're going to reach ecological thresholds. We just don't know. Like all complex, chaotic systems, we may have rapid nonlinear change. IPCC operates, assuming everything is a relatively smooth change. That's not the way climate operates. Everyone knows that there are climate surprises. I'm going to show you a chart of instability in the climate system. The real scientists are really worried about the rapid nonlinear, but they don't know where it is, and they often leave it out of their descriptions of what may likely happen. IPCC usually puts a footnote, but it's usually buried in the footnote. It could be worse, but they then go ahead and quote the minimum and maximum 95% confidence level of climate sensitivity, ignoring the tails of the distribution, but policymakers want to know what the tails are, okay? Ethics would require that you identify really catastrophic low probability events. I actually think IPCC is doing a bad job in highlighting all of that. One of the things I'm claiming is that scientists who we need in this debate to help us understand this problem often operate by a set of rules that make sense in research science, but don't make sense when you apply science to public policy. It's a different kind of question. Most of you know that most scientists, but not all science disciplines, require 95% confidence levels before you can publish in the journals. As I said earlier this morning, but if you're conducting research that might create a black hole, as this one Swiss scientist did, you might want to be sure that we don't create it with 99% probability, not 95% probability, maybe 99.999% probability, because theoretically, the black hole can consume the entire universe. The point of this is that science, applied to public policy, raises fundamental ethical questions, not only scientific questions, and those questions always include, but are never talked about, given what we know, who should have the burden of proof to prove what the risk is, and what quantity of proof should satisfy the burden of proof. The law is a little bit better on this, but the lawyers are all confused about this too. And I could go on with the law is really inconsistent about this. Everybody, I think, is shockingly confused about thinking about scientific uncertainty and the obvious ethical questions that it raises. It's completely missing from the discourse in the United States about this problem. The debate is 35 years old. Lyndon Johnson gave a speech about climate change as being a risk. The National Academy of Science under Jimmy Carter did the first report. There have been 5 U.S. Academy of Science reports saying that this is a really huge problem. The United States Academy of Science is the place that we're supposed to go to get the best expert evidence on this. Most people completely ignore what the U.S. Academy of Sciences has said. All of this discussion can be understood, although if you do this, you're simplifying the reality as the consensus position versus the skeptical position. And that's an oversimplification because there are nuances of this. But let me make the following claim. The consensus view is usually the view articulated by IPCC, and it has certain elements. Notice it's not a consensus on all of the issues. It's not a denial that there may be negative feedbacks that we don't fully understand. The consensus view is, A, that the planet is warming. I don't know any of the skeptics that deny that anyway. The evidence is just irrefutable. It's not only the temperature record, it's the ice record, it's the animals, it's everything. Robust lines of evidence that the planet is warming. I know some of the skeptics denied it as recently as 8 years ago. None of them that I know deny it. They're actually, some of them will look at the last 4 or 5 years and say it's stopped warming, but there's a very strong response to that. But the consensus view is that the planet is warming. 2, that it's warming because, not because of the natural variability, but with higher and higher levels of confidence because of human causation. And there are actually 8 or 9 different lines of evidence, including the fact that carbon appearing, carbon-12, carbon-14 is fossil carbon, including the way the oceans heat up, including the way the upper atmosphere heats up if it's the sun versus human causation, and the way the oceans are heating up, if it's the El Nino or La Nina, the ocean acts differently than whether it's warming from climate change. There's 8 or 9 different lines of evidence that supports that this is human caused. The first time I looked at this, I saw that the greenhouse gases were in direct proportion to human use of fossil fuel around the world. It's like a straight one-to-one correspondence. It's one hell of a coincidence if the carbon appearing in the atmosphere is not from human activities. Just looking at that line, we knew that line 30 years ago. Okay. So what I am claiming is not that everything is settled, but I'm claiming that there's a lot of strong evidence to be very, very worried about what we're doing. Okay? And to insist that we know everything is part of the failure to understand how ethical issues sort of influence how science should talk about the application of science to public policy. And it's only because, in my view, of the failure to integrate ethics into the discussion of what science does that some people can manipulate the public discussion of what science does, and I'll explain that in a little bit more detail. So you have a consensus view. Every Academy of Science in the world supports the consensus view. There are at least 19 of them that have asked poll their membership. It's something similar to the U.S. Academy of Science. They've issued joint statements. Every scientific organization with expertise, I think there are like 120 of them now, polled their membership to see whether they support the consensus view. Both science and I think Nature did polls of scientists actually do research in the science in the last 2 years, and I forget whether it was the Science or Nature claimed 98% of the scientists support the consensus view, and the other supported, the other was 96 or 97% of the scientists actually doing research support the consensus view. Now notice again, the consensus view doesn't say we know exactly what's going to happen. The claim is that there are certain elements of this that have been wired down that is cause for huge concern. This is one graph of the instability of the climate system. The system was unusually stable for the last 10,000 years. If you go back even further, this is most of the scientists that I know are worried not about whether we will increase temperatures by 2 or 3 degrees, but we start to really make the climate system really unstable with huge harms going to some people more than others. But our models can't predict that because we don't know where the thresholds in ecological systems. The dirty little secret is when in environmental policymakers are always faced with uncertainty, almost always faced with uncertainty. I started to realize this. I was litigating 80 cases all at once for the state of Pennsylvania when I'm studying ethics, and they were all about uncertainty. They were about whether you could draw any inferences from incomplete information. They weren't about settled science. but yet the scientists attacked each other as doing bad science. They were extraordinarily inarticulate about the maybe balance of the evidence, or the preponderance of the evidence, or that the scale of certainty you need shifts depending. Ethicists would say, what's at stake? Who's going to get harmed? Is it reversible? There's a whole series of questions that ethicists would require you to ask about what to do in the face of uncertainty. Yet we're training people as if there are black and white answers. Now that's a somewhat oversimplification. Scientists are trained to put probability statements, usually using Bayesian probability techniques, but there are problems with that too, which are not disclosed. You can only rationally quantify uncertainty if you have some understanding of the physical constraints of the system. And there's some things that even Bayesian probability statement is just a wild-ass guess of, but yet we don't talk about it. We talk about it to the policymakers at least as if we've given people a rational scientific basis. And on top of that, we then do cost-benefit analysis on the probability statements, which is even more absurd because the economic stuff is based upon the uncertainty and doesn't disclose the fact that climate sensitivity may be 8 degrees centigrade or 9 degrees centigrade. And we may not care about it, but the people in Africa care about that, and we haven't consulted with them to identify, to get them to say it's perfectly okay to do a cost-benefit analysis, assuming climate sensitivity is 2.3 degrees centigrade. It's all hidden. It's all hidden in technical language that no one can penetrate. In fact, the only one that really can penetrate are the people that produce the models in many cases, and know where the assumptions are in the process. So there's something terribly wrong with how we talk about the application of science to public policy. And now the last half of this will be talking about this thing I call the climate change disinformation campaign. There seems to be a new book every day, almost, about this. All of a sudden, it's really starting to, and some of them are really good scholarly works about how this worked, who did what, how this all came about. It really started in the early 1980s. It actually started with tobacco companies. Some of the earliest climate skeptics were not only using the same tactics, were the same people using the same public relations firms that have the same strategy about how to attack climate change. This is a diagram of how it all works. There are most all of this is funded either by fossil fuel industry, unfortunately, and not all oil companies, but a couple of them will, probably one or two will not go name this by the time we're finished. The corporations, the Chamber of Commerce, conservative foundations, they've created and support think tanks. I did a chapter in the book and I was shocked what I found. There's 700 of them that are doing technical and economic analysis of environmental policy. Almost all of them you can link to interests that have economic interest in not being regulated. They've created think tanks, they've created front groups, and the problem is people don't know that they're front groups. They've created, and I will now talk about the tactics that has in fact been going on. This chart was developed by a Rockefeller fund, which is really interesting because Rockefeller was the oil company. This is a website funded by Rockefellers that show you the 8 or 9 skeptics that are tied to these think tanks. They're all the same people, and they're all linked to these different to think tanks. And you can now trace the money. We know how the plumbing worked. We know how the money flowed, and so they also hired public relations firms, which is really disturbing ethically. This is really disturbing because they didn't say to the public relations firms, only publicize what the science is telling you. They told the public relations firm there were copies of contracts that said, we want you to target uneducated white males in the western part of the United States and make them think that the science is uncertain. That was the contract to the public relations firms. Okay. Wow, if that's not verging on criminal, they didn't care what the science said. They wanted to spin the science and to get Americans to think that the science was much more unsettled than it actually is. given what's at stake here, given the fact there are 10 million people dying the most ugly, horrific death of starvation, and it may be linked to fossil fuels, this is not negligence, this is awful, this is criminal in some sense. And I want to talk about that more specifically. There are a lot of people just talking about what they believe, they have rights for free speech, I don't want to discourage that, but some of this behavior is way beyond simply people talking about what they believe, and that's what I want to talk about. We know the Global Climate Coalition. I was the Pennsylvania representative to the RGGI process, okay, which Pennsylvania never joined the northeastern states because the coal industry was strong in Pennsylvania. I was in the room when the coal industry came into the meeting and said, don't do this or you're politically dead meat. In effect, I'm translating what they said, and we didn't join. I went to, but under Republican Governor Thornburg, they sent me to a Global Climate Coalition meeting, and I was in the middle of the meeting. They thought I was on their side, and I wasn't on their side. And I kept thinking to myself, I'm personally capable of not telling people what I really think about this. So I've been in the meetings where the Global Climate Coalition, which was funded by ExxonMobil, British Petroleum, told the state representative that there was no scientific basis for this, that it was all a hoax, okay, and this would destroy the economy. The think tanks have been really large players in this. ExxonMobil, according to Rolling Stone, I haven't checked this independently, funded 40 think tanks, right-wing think tanks on climate change alone, and they were currently funding something called Climate Depot, which I'm about to tell you about, which, if this is not sheer evil, I don't know what evil is, and to sow disinformation about this. The think tanks don't subject they do report. What do think tanks do? They issue reports, and noticeably they're technical reports. They're economic claims or scientific claims. They bring together all of their people into a conference, and they publish the results of the conference as if it's the same thing as a scientific journal, and then they report that. They're manufacturing the science of all of this, okay? And that is in fact going on. The other thing that's really disturbing about this, and I've been in the middle of this and I didn't see it coming, and it's so incredibly shocking. Most of their budget, or a large part of the budget, 10% of these think tanks are for outreach. So they send their technical reports to the politicians and to the newspapers, and if the newspapers don't publish it, they then intimidate the newspapers. Why didn't you cover this? You're biased on balance. There is a huge amount of intimidation going on. And I can tell you because I've been in the middle of how it works. But this is only one of the things. The think tanks publish reports from people that believe with them, but don't subject to peer review. Okay, it's not peer-reviewed stuff, it's simply claims, and the claims have a whole variety of tactics that most scientists would know is wrong, okay? So you don't cherry-pick evidence. You don't say that because we don't know the negative feedback of climate sensitivity that the entire science is a hoax. That's not skeptical science, that's a lie. That is a lie to make that kind of claim. So they're not publishing reasonable skepticism. There are some reasonable skeptics out there, but that's not what I'm describing. I'm describing tactics that are disinformation. They're lies. They're saying the entire thing is a hoax, when every academy of science in the world supports the consensus view. That can't be correct. They've not pointed to any studies that show that it's not human causation. They're only claiming that there's not enough information to show human causation, and ignoring the lines of evidence that IPCC and everyone has looked at in terms of attribution and fingerprint studies. They're ignoring the evidence and claiming there's no evidence of human causation. They're manufacturing the science. They're creating fake lists of science. There's 300 scientists, and only 1 or 2 of them actually do research on the matter. And they're saying, see, it's not settled because I have a list of 3,000 people. We've looked at who the people are. Some of them are Mickey Mouse, and not only not scientists, they're not even people on their list in some cases, and claiming that they have a list of science, okay? Now, of all the things that's going on, this is the thing that really disturbs me the most, and that's why I have decided to try to encourage everybody to talk about this. There's cyberbullying the scientists and the journalists. And how does this work? Well, this is a website called planetdepot.org. It's run by Mark Morano. And if you're a journalist, like someone from the New York Times or Washington Post, and you put a story that's quote scientists saying that this is real, your personal picture goes on this website with your personal email. And they invite the other 120 websites that are following this to attack you. So the first time it happened to me, I wrote an article claiming that maybe the failure to do anything about climate change was equally as bad, if not worse, than the Gulf spill. Okay? So there was more moral failure in the United States about climate change than there was in the Gulf spill. And the first time that happened, I got a call from a colleague at the University of Toronto, said, watch out, Mark Morano just put my picture up, and I would be bullied. Within 20 minutes after I got the call, for the next 2 days, I got emails saying, nothing substantively, no substantive reaction to it. You're a liar. I hope your children die. I hope you have a car wreck. And it's that kind of really aggressive stuff. And for me, I'm perfectly okay with this. In fact, it's sort of a badge of honor that I didn't happen. But unfortunately, they're doing it to the scientists and to the journalists. Okay? And I think it's worked. I have talked to scientists who say it's not worth it to be put up with this. I'm not going to go there. Okay? And I suspect that some of the journalistic coverage we've got is also knowing that you'll be labeled to be biased or a liar or untruthful if you do this. So, there's also evidence that the people making the claims, the own scientists, were telling you that it is true. Andrew Revkin had published several examples of the Global Climate Coalition, so they're out supporting people like Mark Morano. My son always calls me at the worst time. Sorry about that. So, in any event, they've created astroturf groups. You know what an astroturf group is? Okay. So almost every newspaper in the United States in a major metropolitan area, if you write a climate change thing in the op-ed page, I usually need a nurse. Okay, so astroturf groups are groups that publish letters to the editor as if they're regular citizens, and they're actually being organized by a public relations firm. That's going on not only on climate change, but lots of other social policy issues, hiring public relations firms. Of course, they're funding political campaigns. And the other thing they do, of course, is not only spin the science, but spin the economics also. So you will find claims like, if we pass climate change, it will destroy the coal industry in Pennsylvania or the agricultural industry in Kansas. And so there's a lot of that going on. They're making claims that are completely untruths, as I said before. Climate Depot's website is the Emailgate scandal was an interesting example of they claiming that if the assertions about Michael Mann and I forget the guy's name in the UK were true, it debunked the entire science of climate change. It never would have had that effect. It was only about a relatively small period of tree ring data that really didn't affect at all in any way the fingerprint studies and the attribution studies and the heart of what was the consensus position. It was always a peripheral issue at best. It was three emails out of, we think, 10,000 emails that cherry-picked something that they claimed. And with what's even more amazing, within 48 hours, it was all around the world that the science of climate change had been completely debunked. It happened before Copenhagen, 3 or 4 weeks before Copenhagen, and it really unsettled the Copenhagen negotiations. And to this day, even though that there are now 7 institutions that have looked at this scandal and completely exonerated the main players, people still think that the science is a complete hoax. The American Enterprise Institute put an advertisement out saying they would pay anyone $10,000 that wrote a critical review of the upcoming IPCC report. This is Climate Depot. And these are all the people funding this. Okay, so what's so interesting, and you've got to dig to figure this out, which these books that I'm now alluding to have done. There are front groups and websites, and they usually report to other front groups, which we now know is funded by either what unites all of these people is a belief in unfettered free markets. So they're all tied to a belief that unfettered free markets can solve all human problems, and that environmental protection and climate change is simply a strategy to go to socialism. Okay, so all the skeptics, all the think tanks, they're all tied to sources of money, which is this belief system. So, I've now ended my sort of introduction to this. I just want to end with a couple of other things. Climate change doesn't raise one civilization-challenging ethical issue. It raises a whole host of them. What's the stabilization goal? What is my fair share? What is the United States' fair share of global emissions? Are we responsible for adaptation? The biggest issue in the negotiations that most Americans don't know is who's going to pay for the damages? Who's going to pay for adaptation? Okay. From the developing point of view, that has been the big issue. Ethics would say, and there's a lot of soft law norms that support my claim that the ethics of some of these issues are not controversial. These are actually issues, some of these issues, although not all of them, are issues about there appears to be an ethical consensus as to what ethics requires. Some don't. The issue of how you allocate responsibility is really a quite contested issue among theories of what are called distributive justice, but others are quite clear. No nation has the right to pollute transboundary that harms other people. That's all well settled. It's in the Climate Change Convention. And what that means is all the excuses we've been using are completely irrelevant. If we have a duty not to harm people, we have duties and responsibilities not to harm them, and we can't use the excuses which we use as national interest alone trumps everything. We can't use the excuse that we don't have to do anything because China hasn't done anything. We've already agreed that every nation has a duty immediately to reduce their emissions to their fair share of safe global emissions, and ethics would say no nation can simply decide to continue to exceed their fair share because some other nation is exceeding their fair share. So, in the China issue, we haven't framed that in a way that identifies the obvious ethical problems with this. So, in conclusion, as I slow down a little bit, what I try to convince you is that this is an ethical issue, and if you believe me, we all have to figure out how to turn up the volume of the ethical dimensions of this huge issue. And I'm happy to talk about this because I feel I have a responsibility to knowing what I know to get other people to see this as an ethical issue. And what that would mean practically is the next time the senator from Pennsylvania, a Democrat, by the way, stands up and says, I'm not going to do anything about climate change because it will hurt the coal industry in Pennsylvania, someone would say back to that senator, we understand why you're interested in, and you have a duty to be concerned about the coal industry in Pennsylvania, but are you denying that your duties, responsibilities, and obligations to people in Africa? And so how does your decision to not harm the coal people, how is it responsive to your duties, responsibilities, and obligations to other people? So I'd be happy to take any questions.
We're video recording this. If you have any questions, please step up to the microphone so that we can get you on record. You can make a line if you'd like.
I'll start off with a question that I've been thinking about. As someone who's done a lot of work with the ethics of climate change, I wonder if you could address the issue of blame. I had a conversation I thought was interesting with someone who suggested that blame is a big issue here, and if climate change was seen to be not anthropogenic, was being caused largely by some natural forces, that the very same people who are the leading skeptics would actually be at the front lines of pushing to do something about it, but because they're being blamed, this leads to a lot of the backlash. So I wonder if you could comment on that a little bit.
Well, so that's actually a very good question. And the blame game really gets tricky when you're thinking about individual responsibility. So here's what ethics says about individual blame, which makes individual responsibility a contested question. Okay? Most ethics would say that once you're on notice that you're doing dangerous behavior, you have a duty to stop it. Okay? But if you have the ability to stop it. Okay? So before you assert blame at the individual level, I believe you have to establish that someone had reason to believe. Notice, you don't need to know that it's actually causing harm. You actually only have to be on notice that it's probably causing harm, and that you have the ability to do something about it. So, what does that mean? What I think it means practically, and this is a much longer discussion about all this, and time will allow, but I think there is no excuse for anyone driving a really big car that they have no need for, once they're on notice that this is a really potential threat to the people in Africa. Once people are on notice that they understood, or should understand, that this is affecting people in Africa, people with a very large home that they don't have a need for should understand that they have no excuse for doing that. Okay, so blame is a tricky thing. Okay? But the way this is being defended is not on the grounds of blame. They're saying there's no scientific evidence. They're saying I have no duties, responsibilities, and obligations, even if it's true. I can only look at self-interest alone. No ethical system would condone that. None would condone that if this is an ethical problem, I can ignore my responsibilities to people and harm it. You at least have to have a reason for why it's okay to harm it. And so, blame is a tricky issue. Nations have already agreed that they have a duty in the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Most Americans don't know that when we actually signed the treaty, George Bush's father, at the signing the treaty, I worked for the chief negotiator for the United States, who was the negotiator of Reagan. He wrote a book about this, about what we did. The U.S. has been the obstructionist for about 30 years now in the climate negotiations. Not the only obstructionist. Saudi Arabia is pretty close to the top. But for 30 years, the European Union put on the table in 1988 a proposal that developed countries agreed to reduce emissions by 20% below 1990 levels by the year 2000. It's been the U.S., and it continues to be Obama, despite the world's hope that Obama will change this, and that's a long story in itself. And the U.S. already agreed that nations have duties not to do this. Okay? So you can blame nations pretty strongly. Individuals becomes a little bit more tricky, I think.
I had a question about a graph that you showed, I think it was 2 slides earlier, about the companies that support, I think, lobbying, and you're saying it's connected to the think tanks. Is there any evidence of what they're lobbying for, or is that just their total amount lobbying, or paying to lobby for all of the issues that they're concerned about?
There probably is, but I don't know the evidence. I suspect there is. There are now sociologists working on this. There are a lot of people starting to work on this, but I don't know about the lobbying financial flow.
And then I had one follow-up question. With these bigger companies, in these books that are talking about denialists and disinformation, do they ever talk about the things that they do fund that are beneficial to the science of climate change, like biofuels, and even climate change studies itself that are unrelated to like oil and gas?
You have seen the commercials. Carbon dioxide is good for you, right? Or about 10 years ago, there were a whole series of commercials on TV claiming this would be good for people. Okay? But they completely ignore that it will kill tens of millions of people that haven't consented to be harmed. Okay? Ethics would not allow you to harm some people because it will help other people if you haven't asked the people that you've been harmed to consent to be harmed. So the notion that it will be good for you, at best, could only mean a small part of the world it might be good for, and you all probably know the last thing I did for the Clinton administration was go to the Army War College and do war games over national security issues. That's 12 years ago. The Army knew that this was a potential cause of conflict. To say that it is good for you completely dismisses the fact that it may trigger a war, a scarcity war, and so it seems.
I'd like to add to that, and I think this speaks to Michelle's question. I'm a sociologist, and this is not my area of inquiry, but I read some of the sociological literature. And you don't even have to be a social scientist to be aware that many of the fossil fuel companies are indeed spending money on renewable energy. There are tax incentives to do so. There is also public relations incentives. I think some of Michelle Mary, where are you, Michelle? Some of her research on climate change related issues is funded by the fossil fuel industry. So there is plenty of money to go around if you are a major corporation. And the question is, to what extent are these same corporations, or maybe they're not all funding renewable energy, but also funding climate skepticism and have an interest in kind of walking and playing both sides of the street. And I suppose you could see that as fair-minded, that you're funding renewable energy and you're also funding climate change skepticism through think tanks that have a political agenda. But just because you're doing one doesn't mean you are not also doing the other in either direction. We have time for one more question. I think we have Paula Smith.
Hi, I'm back again. Well, these, I mentioned earlier, it's kind of going on the theme that we've been discussing back and forth since your visit, but these are common issues, ethical issues that indigenous peoples have been facing for decades. Why now? Why do you see it such a big issue now, ethical issues? I mean, why are you coming up with it?
Well, what's true for this entire 30 years has been no discussion of the ethical issues. There's not a peep from the New York Times from anybody about everything I've been talking about. They cover the science as if it's okay. Either science can tell us exactly what's going to happen, or there's no problem. And so this is a 30-year failure to discuss what I think are the obvious ethical limitations of scientific and economic claims about climate change. And I told people earlier today that I'm not the only one noticing that this is missing. I got an email from Ban Ki-moon's chief of staff at the United Nations about 4 months ago saying, we've been reading your blog, and we'd like to know if you would come to the United Nations and help us try to figure out how to integrate ethics into the negotiations. I said, wow, that's pretty amazing. So I've been up there talking to them, and we're talking about different strategies. But the only reason why they asked me is because my phone's still, even though I don't have it. So the reason why they did it is because they figured out that ethics is the crucial missing element in the international discussion. So when you go to the negotiations, most countries act as if as if only their self-interest counts. Okay? And so they're frustrated. They're really frustrated that countries are not articulating positions that seem to acknowledge that we have to reduce their dependence. But now, I think the Europeans are much better than this than Americans on this, which is a whole another interesting story. The Europeans seem to get it more quickly. They're amazed that we're still using scientific uncertainty as a justification, generally speaking. I think what we've been talking about is particularly a problem in the United States as I go around the world. I was in China last week speaking to the first international conference on climate ethics that the Chinese university ever put on, and they all got everything I was saying. They were studying the politics in the United States. It was pretty interesting. One woman presented a paper on the politics in Canada about scientific uncertainty. Okay, so does that answer your question? So the question is, why is this such an obvious ethical issue? Why has no one spotted that? That's a more interesting question. And I think higher education is failing if you're a scientist in a really good school and you're taught, and for good reason, to keep your values out of what you see, you're only supposed to make inferences based upon the evidence. Values have nothing to do with what you're doing. You're supposed to support your claims. And that makes a lot of sense, and we should still encourage scientists to do that when they're engaged in public research or where the search for the truth is an issue. But when you apply science to public policy, you don't have that luxury. The governments are supposed to protect people if the risk is great, even before you know exactly what the risk is. So we're completely failing to educate scientists and engineers about, and as a result, it's perfectly okay to draw inferences based on the balance of the evidence and other evidentiary rules, but scientists aren't taught, and even though the scientists are critical for making us understand this issue, most of my friends become strangely inarticulate once we start, and they know that they need help, but they don't know what to talk about. They want to talk about it, but they can't. And I think ethics is, in fact, the way to make sense of all of this, because once you understand it's an ethical problem, you realize that you have a duty not to do dangerous behavior. Complete proof is not necessary. The quantitative proof and the burden proof will shift depending upon what's at stake. So I think higher education is part of the problem, and I can say the same thing about economic theory, too. A lot of the founders of neoclassical economic theory, Kenneth Arrow, all admit the ethical problems with this, but that's not what we're teaching people. So I know some of my economists, not all of them, they can't spot the ethical issues in their own sort of analytical analysis of this. And I think that's a failure. Cost-benefit analysis is perfectly okay to do, and we should do it. But people should understand its limits when applied to this kind of problem. And there are serious ethical problems when using cost-benefit analysis, I would assert, for this kind of problem, when the harms and benefits are disaggregated, discounting means everything worthless that's 20 years out, you commodify everything, you put life and value without consenting to people, and you build the economic analysis on top of all the uncertainty and make assumptions about climate sensitivity and not tell people what the assumptions are. So, at least the way I see the world, there's an amazing failure to educate people about basic ethical issues that come up when you apply analytic tools to public policy that people are not taught. When I got out of engineering school, I would go on ethical questions I tripped over. Okay? I was never exposed to it. I didn't know what it means. I thought it was about burping in public or cheating on my tax and things. I had no exposure to it whatsoever, and it's not. And yet we're training people to do analytic techniques as the only prescriptive guidance, such as economic analysis, that ignores human rights, that ignores probabilities of everything into a commodity that must be built upon uncertainty, which is disclosed. It has to make assumptions about costs and benefits, about things that we have no idea about. And it's all there, but it's technical stuff presented as the truth, as if there's no controversy about all of this. That's not just incomplete, that's wrong, because it's misleading, in my view. So, I am not at all attacking economists. We need economists in the game. They can help us think through what's the most efficient way of dealing with this. But there are some problems, I think, with how we present economic arguments about this kind of problem to the public without disclosing the fact that we do these responsibilities and obligations to other people, among other things, not only self-interest.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much